Hello, everyone. We are here with the St. Matthew ACC Church Bible Study being held at the house of Ruth and Junia. And we welcome you to this, which is our third session or fourth.
Well, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. At any rate, we welcome you all here. Bob Romano is coming. That's good. Hi, Bob. So people are showing up. And anyway, we are continuing on our study of the struggle for authority as seen in the New Testament and as seen in some of the apocryphal books that were written after the books that are in the New Testament. As some of you probably have already figured out, in this section, we're looking at a couple of apocryphal books, one called the Acts of Peter and one called the Acts of Paul. And those of you that are here, I have copies of those that I can give you. I did not get them 3-hole punched and sorted, but after class we'll set them up and you can take those. But I'll give you a little thumbnail sketch of them.
Martha, are you on a particular page here?
On the guide, I'm on page 15. The 10-19-22 section. And last week you'll recall that we looked at how the Gospels across their publications were different in how they presented the role of women. As Peter was stronger, Mary Magdalene was more minimized. And where Mary Magdalene appeared more prominent, Peter was minimized. And this is something I don't think they got together and did that. I think that each gospel was written in its own community context. And they did have clearly some preferences as to who they felt was most important among the apostles. And in the early church, the press for recognition began with Paul, who said that he himself was an apostle. He had met Christ on the road and had a vision of him. And you'll remember we said that Paul's definition of who is an apostle was much more simple. At the beginning, he's writing between 50 and 60 CE, whereas the Gospels in general are believed to have been written between 70 and 100 CE. So there's a gap of time, and by the time you get to the Gospels, especially with Luke and Acts, which is kind of the sequel to Luke's gospel, we find that the criteria for being an apostle has incredibly changed and become much more specific, and men who accompanied Jesus the whole time, beginning from the time of the baptism of John until Jesus was taken up, and must have witnessed a resurrection experience within 40 days after, and they had to be men. So they pretty well left us girls out, didn't they, Dakota? Yes, they did. And it pretty well left Paul out, too. Paul would not be considered an apostle by these criteria. And we see that issue going on as what to do with Paul and how Peter's pattern of authority develops over time. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the
Sorry, what are you doing?
I'm doing
Leslie.
Magdalene Bible study right
Hey,
now.
honey.
Cool.
Yeah, and
Hello, my dear. We're glad to see you. Thank you for coming. We'll talk just a little bit about the Acts of Peter and Acts of Paul. These are fairly long reads. When I wrote on your handout, Read Gospel of Peter, it is not long. I was thinking, I meant to say Acts of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is actually very short, and we'll talk about it later. And I have copies of it for you. But the Acts of Peter, we think were written no later than 200 CE. In general, the time frame given is like 120 CE to 200 CE. And here we have followers of Peter, obviously not Peter himself, and it is recounting the activities of Peter that reportedly happened. And it is an interesting document. It is considered one of the Gnostic Gospels. The theology in it is not that of Orthodox. You can see as you read it, there are elements of the Gnostics in it. But Peter, in this gospel, seems to have a different attitude toward women. As your handout said, there were incidents in there such as he did not heal his own daughter. He told her that she should go lie down again in her own infirmity. This was expedient for him and for her. And what he meant by that is that if she were healed, he goes on to say and alleges that the Lord told him that this daughter will bring hurt to many souls if her body is continued whole. And so, in other words, better for her to stay infirm so that she could remain pure. Because women's passion...
sorry, that was me. But, oh my God. Really doesn't.
Here's one quote. But when I perceived it, I and her mother, we went down and found the maiden, that one whole side of her body from her toes even to her head was palsied and withered. And we bore her away, praising the Lord, which had preserved his handmaid from defilement and shame. This is the cause of the matter, why the maiden continueth so today. So basically, the view of women given in the gospel, the Acts of Peter, is that they are really at risk because of their sexual passion. Methinks it is projection. I think that was an act of projection on the part of the men, but the picture described is that you submit, and it's better if you're handicapped and you just do as you're told. Is basically the picture that is presented.
Martha, what she was being saved from is just marriage?
What now?
What she was being saved from? What
Sexual attraction. She couldn't be sexually attracted because then she'd attract men and it wouldn't be their fault, it would be hers.
Well, what they're saving her from is marriage, just an ordinary marriage, or
Well,
interaction with a man.
marriage would be, it's less than remaining a virgin in his system. Now, there were some interesting stories in here that we won't have time to go into, but there's an account of a dog in the epistle here. What am I trying to say? Not epistle. The Acts of Peter. And a dog comes up and is a dog that can speak. And the dog reveals many things that are in connection with Peter. And so there was a person in this book that was kind of an enemy of the Christians and an enemy of Peter. And interestingly, his name was Simon. And this dog is kind of an intermediary in a sense. And so here is a dumb animal sent unto thee, which hath received a human voice, to confound thee and show thee to be a deceiver and liar. Have thou taken thought so long to say at last, tell him I am not within? And so the dog comes to Peter as he sat with the multitude, and the dog related what he had done to Simon. And thus spake the dog unto an angel and apostle of the true God, Peter. So the dog says that God will give you the reward of your work. And when the dog had said this, he fell down at the apostle Peter's feet and gave up the ghost. And when the great multitude saw with amazement the dog speaking, some of them began throwing themselves at Peter's feet, and some said, give us another sign. And so it goes on, the conflict between Simon and Peter. And in another account, a baby that is only 7 months old received a man's voice and spoke and berated the Simon that was causing all the problems. And so it's really an interesting story. Now when the night fell, Peter, while yet walking, beheld Jesus clad in a vesture of brightness, smiling and saying to him, already as much people of the brotherhood returned through me, and through the signs you have wrought in my name. But there's a contest of faith going on, and in the latter part of the book, it involves a woman named Eubula. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. At any rate, she comes into the question as to what her role is, and she gives up everything she has and gave them for the service of the poor and was comforted. In general, the role of women is secondary, or they seem to be somehow trapped in this terrible blight of being full of passion, that seeming is not mentioned for the men, but the women are supposed to be full of passion. There are some very beautiful parts of the book. I want to read you one thing I found that I thought was absolutely beautiful. It could serve as a prayer. This Jesus you have, brethren, the door, the light, the way, the bread, the water, the life, the resurrection, the refreshment, the pearl, the treasure, the seed, the abundance, the mustard seed, the vine, the plow, the grace, the faith, the word. He is all things, and there is none other greater than he. Unto him be praise, world without end. Amen. I thought that was exceptionally beautiful. But the stories are kind of fantastical, and the role of women is not too strong in the Acts of Peter. It can be compared to the Gospels on certain levels. In that chart you have that I gave you, you can actually look and see where they're compared side by side. Now the Acts of Paul is different in several ways. First of all, the manuscripts from where it was derived were badly damaged. And when you read this, you'll have a handout with this, you can read this. There are a lot of holes in the script. It'll tell you where there's missing pages or missing phrases, and they'll walk you through it. But the one part that does seem to be relatively complete is the story of Paul and Thecla. Thecla is a woman who gives up her fiancé to follow with Paul and to remain a virgin so that she may work along with Paul. And in that process, he gives her authority to teach. So that is an interesting difference between Acts of Paul and Acts of Peter. And some of the gospel stories seem to be repeated, but with a little different version of them. But there were also in the books of the Acts of Paul animals that were talked about. Now, when the beasts were led in procession, we're talking about a woman that is about to be killed in the Acts of Paul. They bound her to a fierce lioness, and the queen Tryphena followed after her. But the lioness, when Thecla was set upon her to be killed, licked her feet, and all the people marveled. So we have beasts that are being brought out supposedly to kill Thecla, and the animals just lay down and snuggle, is what I would say, which is very interesting. Thecla, being taken out of the hand of Tryphena, was stripped, and a girdle put upon her, and was cast into the stadium, and lions and bears were set up against her, and a fierce lioness running to her lay down at her feet, and the press of women cried aloud, and a bear ran upon her, but the lioness ran and met him, and tore the bear in sunder, and again a lion trained against men, which was Alexander's, ran upon her, and the lioness wrestled with him and was slain along with him. So we see that Thecla is preserved. Thecla ends up baptizing herself because she's set apart, and she baptized herself and was ready to join Paul. It's very much an interesting read, but we see that Paul allows for women to serve and women to be able to heal others and to teach. So this is kind of a contrast between those two books. And if we look at, let me find my chart. If we look at how those two Gospels compare with the Acts of Peter and Paul in our chart,
What page?
I will start, look at page 4
They're in the back.
of the chart. It's in the back.
What page?
What?
And
Yeah.
in Matthew and Mark, there's an absence of appearances at the resurrection, whether there is a order of or absence of appearances at the resurrection, whether there's a commissioning, what we call a Christophany, that is, Jesus was there, an angelophany, where angels appeared, or none. And we know that in John, the story is much stronger about what happened at the resurrection. These two books that we just talked about, they differ drastically in the roles for men and women. There are models of strong women in Acts of Paul. And Paul is portrayed speaking to men. Peter is much more likely to, in some way, castigate them. The speaking role for women in the Acts of Peter is very few. And in Acts of Paul, there are a number of speaking roles. In Matthew, Mark, and John, there's a prominence to Mary Magdalene to go tell the disciples to meet Jesus. These books don't directly deal with that. They're dealing more with the whole issue of what are acceptable roles for women. So we know in that 100 years, after the first 100 years, there still was a lot of controversy going on among the disciples of Jesus in different communities as to what would be the place of women. And it continues. When you see these two books, you can see that controversy is still going on. It was present in the canonical Gospels. If you look at them across the four Gospels, there's good evidence that there was a difference in the roles of women. There's good evidence that the idea of apostle was not well developed in the Gospels. That term is almost never used until you get to Acts, which is kind of the second book of Luke. And in Acts, the word apostle is used frequently. And in these Acts of Peter and Paul, they do refer to episcopal authority, which is not referred to in the Gospels. Clearly, there's been a development across time where having more of a structure and a hierarchy becomes more and more prominent. And so we begin to see those roles developing after you leave the after you leave the New Testament. The New Testament barely hints of that. And what structure there was, as we talked about, I think in our second session, was in a small open system, everybody had to do some work to keep it going, just like in a small church. Today, the same thing is true, that the smaller organization is, the more multiple roles and work falls on people, and the more openness there is to having new people take over some of the work. And that systemic factor in churches in the first century and in the 21st century is still operant. So we have churches that grew very big and became very rigid and had tighter and tighter rules that were defined about who was in charge and who could be shut out. If you're a big, huge entity and somebody doesn't want to follow your set of rules, there's pretty much indifference. It's not the case of the shepherd with the 99 sheep who's going to go after the one sheep that got lost. No. That's not going to happen in a more complex system. And we see in the 2nd century, there is this development of more antagonism, if you will. I don't think it's wrong to say that there developed antagonism in terms of who could take a leadership role. And so this issue continues on down the timeline. So I'll go back to the original outline here. You have some summaries here of some of the main things. In Acts of Peter,
What page are you on?
the people that were being converted are depicted as loyal to family, and it was upper class men who were being converted in the Acts of Peter. In Acts of Paul, it's upper class women who are being converted and given more authority and space to be, but the difference being that you did choose a life of virginity, of not being married, and to be your own person, as it were. And we see through the ages that same plan carried on. In the Middle Ages, you have families with daughters who didn't want to marry, and many of them went and became nuns. That was your option to get out of getting married. So these options for women did start to expand a little bit, but they did not include having much to say about church development.
Was Acts of Paul written before the Acts of Peter?
What now?
Which one was written first, the Acts
We
of
think-
Paul or Acts of
We
Peter?
think that Acts of Paul was written a little before Acts of Peter, and we think that Peter was aware of Acts of Paul.
It was kind of like the final
And,
say. Or-
We think that they were aware of the canonical book of Acts, which probably was 100 to 120. It's hard to say what manuscripts made it where. They were still handwritten and passed around. And so getting anything written was still a major laborious act to carry these on.
So from what you just said, it seems to me like Peter pretty much edited Paul by omitting a lot of the female.
Peter, in some respects, reinterprets some of the period material in Paul. In the book, the Acts of Peter, has more of a secondary role. He follows Peter around.
Can I ask you a controversial question? Do you think Peter was threatened by women?
You think he was one?
Threatened by women?
Well, that's hard to say. You're in a culture where, in general...
That's the impression I've gotten before. That, I don't know, that's just the impression.
Well, we could...
Insecurity, male
if we
insecurity.
put it in our own time frame and our frame of reference, we might say this person was threatened. I rather doubt that he was. I think that there were different communities that had formed in some places where the women were very strong and had a strong role, and in others, as the thing began to develop and become more structured and hierarchical,
Because
obviously they began to...
To me, Paul was more compassionate and like with Thecla, he gave her a teaching role. And that was extraordinary, as you said back then, you know.
I think Paul recognized the gifts of women. Yeah.
Do you think it had anything to do with their levels of education?
The what?
With their levels of education?
Who was smarter, Paul or Peter? Who was more educated?
Well, if we think of the...
Paul was, right?
If we think of the original...
And usually an educated person
Apostle
is
Peter,
more compassionate or more...
he was not educated like Paul. Paul was extremely well educated.
Did Paul travel more? Also, was he exposed to more of these different communities?
Probably, yeah.
He was a rabbi.
Yes, because he did most of the traveling.
He was from the tribe of Benjamin, so he was a teacher,
But then you
almost a
said,
rabbi.
you said in these teachings, some people didn't consider Paul an apostle.
Peter didn't have that, but he always had a problem with to obey sometimes. You know, when Jesus wanted to teach him to do something, then he go back in, and there you will find fish, and you look at Jesus and say, "Hey, come on, where's the fisher here?" Right?
Yes.
Still like that. That's Peter, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was probably exactly the same with women all around.
Yeah,
When they knew sometimes better than he had a problem. It's
and
a
like
kind of
the movie Mary Magdalene. So
which
Jesus thought
Magdalene, we have fishermen women.
Advice, and when he set Peter out, he made Mary go with her to kind of keep him in check, because he knew Peter was like a loose
He
cannon.
was a kind of a character.
Well, we do know...
Well, I always preferred Paul anyway.
We do know that...
I'll be honest with you, I always did. That's just me for my studies. And I've had really good friends named Paul, and we would joke, and I said, "You're like St. Paul."
My father-in-law is Paul.
Good people.
But I noticed here it says that, so it says that Paul didn't chastise the women or refuse the Eucharist to them. Why would Peter want them to not get the Eucharist?
Exactly, yeah. What did that
Let
have
me
to
see
do
where
with
you
it?
are.
Right?
This is,
When Paul is portrayed speaking to women, messages differ in the two books. In Acts of Paul, he does not chastise or refuse them the Eucharist, as he does in Acts of Peter. They are refused at certain points. Paul strengthens and commissions women in Acts of Paul, telling Thecla, "Go and teach the Word of God." So the tradition from Paul was more open. Now, some have thought in modern times that Paul had been against women teaching, But this is one of the misleading things that we've been taught. If you look at the letters that follow Paul's generation, these were written by a successor to Paul. They're known as the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And we think they were written about 100 to 120 CE. And Paul's writings are 50 to 60 CE. So you've got 40 plus years difference between them. And by the time you get to Timothy, you're getting more mention of authority and roles. And as a result of that, some of the things have been misinterpreted. 1 Timothy 2:12 is the one that's most often cited about women's roles. I do not, and this is on page 16 of your handout, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, a scholar developed what I think is the definitive study of this issue. His name is Ed Wilshire. He was a friend of mine at Biola University. He didn't publish his findings until after he had retired from Biola, because their position has been that the women in the seminary is pretty much relegated to children's ministries, or they're not allowed to be a pastor in that system. So Ed waited till he retired to publish his book, and we have a couple of copies of it. But what Ed did was to look at the original Greek in the New Testament, and there's a huge database called the TLG. It's a database of all of every work known in the Greek language from early to later. It's a massive, massive collection. And so what Ed did was to look at the words that were being translated as authority, authentio. It's only used one time in the New Testament, but there's an infinitive to have authority, authentane, and he researched out what this word meant in the original Greek at the time Paul was writing. And it did not have anything to do with authority. It had to do with having order in worship services. He talked about the anger and quarreling of men, and that women should be quiet too. And basically, the original meaning was committing violent actions, getting, having a fit in church, you might say. So there was a big issue that turns up in the Pauline.
So it was more about semblance and order.
Exactly.
Fighting each other.
Calm down. Quit gossiping and talking. And you men, quit being angry and quarreling among yourselves. This is not what you're supposed to do during worship. And that seems to be a plea for self-restraint on the part of both men and women. I've not done justice to it. The book goes through it in quite detail. But so even those books that have been attributed to Paul, but probably followed Paul, have been misinterpreted about what it was that women were being told they could do or not do. And of course it's been interpreted in the light of where people's own preferences and attitudes fell anyway. So you can read all about it from many multiple perspectives in Bible study guides. But I think it was helpful to go back. What did the word mean back at the time when 1 Timothy was written? And it does not seem to say that women can't have authority. It says women should behave themselves during the order of worship.
Just like men should.
Yeah. Because earlier in the same chapter is the discussion, seems to be a literary parallel between the men being angry and quarreling, and I guess the women, whatever women do. We see it when we go to church. They sit there, blah, 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 and getting people to calm down and be quiet and create a worshipful attitude is still a problem to this day.
Problem in a lot of places.
And we know that Paul, if you look particularly at Romans 16, there's a list of all the disciples that he's thanking for their work. And there are just as many women in that list as men. And the first and only woman mentioned as an apostle was Junia. And we talked about that before, that the verse has been mistranslated. Either she's made a man, Junius, which didn't exist, or instead of being notable among the apostles, she was known by the apostles. So the mistranslations have furthered the problem over the years. So we find, if we look at the context of the next 100 years, we get in some sense a little more clarity about what, how women were trying to find their place in Christian communities. And they were, it seems that in Acts of Peter, they were good for giving money and asking for help. Those are the two major features of women.
And feeding the poor.
Well, they get some credit for that. Yes, they do. But they're given credit for giving money to keep the men going. So those were your upper class women that were carrying the load of the beginning of the Christian movement. They had the houses and the home churches, if you will. And so, that begins to fall away by the time you get to about 200 CE. Those kinds of communities are starting to wane. You're in the context of Rome, where most of these communities were under their structure, that you get the first development of church buildings as separate from homes. And once church buildings begin to develop separate from homes, then women are SOL, if you will.
Wait, X.
You know what SOL is?
Yes.
Shit out of luck.
I have to cut it out, right?
You'll have to cut it out. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't say that, huh? Well, I'm just being myself.
That's funny, because I thought so, but I didn't want to say it.
I wouldn't cut it out. With all due respect, women were out. And so we're studying that transition of authority that women had or didn't have. And we can see all these pieces we can put together that show what the transition was over time. There is a development that was good in the Acts of Paul that needs to be pointed out. It was similar to Gospel of John, and the whole idea of family bond changed when we have Jesus on the cross telling John, "Behold your mother," and telling Mary, "Behold your son." They were not a blood relation. So he's expanding the idea of family. And we see that in the Acts of Paul also, that concept that family is not just your blood relatives. Well, we see that even going back to Jesus, because Jesus says, "My brother and my sister are those who follow my word." And so when conflicts arose, the ones who followed Jesus and his gospel and his word were family in that sense. It begins to develop as an idea. Because remember, in this ancient culture, your family was everything, and you were obligated to your family much more than anybody else. And that's why the promotion of taking care of the widows and orphans was so strong, because an orphan had lost their parents, they had no familial connection. The widows had lost their husbands, they had no familial connection. So these two groups were very often impoverished and left behind. And we have the admonition to help the poor, to help the widows and help the orphans. And then we have this development of family that goes beyond blood relationships, which I think is one of the most central aspects of early Christianity that we should pay attention to. Being in a Christian community means that you have brothers and sisters that are not in your birth family. And I think that's a treasure that we have. This was where I think, from my study of the Gnostics, that they lost it. What they brought us that was positive, they had some weird theologies, okay? We won't go into all their weird theologies, but one of their principles that was very influential in early Christianity was that your spiritual self is the self that you develop, and your higher spiritual instinct is the most important aspect of you. They kind of rejected physicality, and they rejected, that's why the whole thing about sex being considered something that you would avoid if you were going to be a worker developed, because in the Gnostic tradition, the body was not accepted as part of the whole person. The only important part was the spiritual part. Well, we gained something from recognizing and gaining insight spiritually. But what the Gnostics lost, I did a study on this years ago, and I concluded that their main downfalling and why they ultimately have pretty well died out was that they did not recognize community. They did not recognize the familial bond and the sharing. It was more like a personal goal or a personal journey to seek the highest ideas of an experience of spirituality on your own. But it did not have what the early church had in terms of our bonds are with one another. Our bonds are with Christ, but our bonds are also with one another. I think that's why they ultimately failed. But we can learn a lot from reading some of their manuscripts. And of course, I'm not surprised they were not considered canonical when you have dogs that are speaking and 7-month-old babies that are speaking and telling people what they should be thinking and doing with the voice of a man and a 7-month-old baby or whatever. Some aspects of these stories were quite fanciful, but you'll find them interesting reading, and you will find little pearls like that one I read you that I think could be used for a prayer. All of the attributes of Jesus strung together. I haven't seen that anywhere else, and I think it was beautiful. Any other thoughts from any of you guys? Hi, Robert. Gosh, you're a quiet bunch.
We are. I'm just appalled, as usual, at Peter and the Peter lineage. You know, the whole idea that women can't be trusted because men are interested sexually in them. So it's the woman's fault. And we still see that today.
Yeah.
That attitude still exists.
It takes two to tango. It's not, It
It
always has, right?
We're just having that conversation.
And I think one of the reasons the Gnostics died out is because they were not sexual.
Right.
They were
Yeah.
Produce more followers.
Yeah.
no, they all died out.
Yeah, they seem to disappear from influence by about 350, 400. You don't hear any more of them again, except where they are argued in the early patristic fathers who are sure to point out their
Heresy.
bad theology. They point out, yes. Yeah, the theology.
I find something very attractive in the agnostics, though.
Yeah, I do too.
There's something that speaks to me in the Gnostics.
Yeah.
Like, I use the Gospel of Thomas for prayer frequently.
Oh yes, we've got copies of the Gospel of Thomas for you guys and the stuff I had printed off. Yeah, I think that a lot of people think that was close to or should have been canonical, but there's still argument about whether it was early or later.
Well, it's like a series of Zen koans.
Right.
And you can't read it with a dualistic mind.
Right.
That's what is attractive about it, to me.
It's very symbolic.
You have to have another idea. You can't be left and right. You can't be black and white.
Right. Right. Well, we won't get too much about Thomas in this study, but we're scanning through some of the apocryphal books for what they can tell us about the conflicts over authority in the church. And I don't think Thomas dealt with that very much. He didn't go there.
Can I
No,
ask,
not at all.
can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
Leslie said she's drawn to Gnosticism and she's drawn to Thomas's writings.
right.
Is there a relationship between Thomas's writings and Gnosticism?
I think that
Because I don't know anything about either.
I would say so. I would say the Gospel of Thomas is basically Gnostic. It's not Gnostic in the idea that there's no consideration of matter, not quite. But in terms of, not private revelation, how would you put it? That it is the individual who matures spiritually. It's not so much in community.
right.
It's more, and that's why it looks like it's Gnostic, but it's not quite there. It's not quite heretical to my view.
It's not. You'll see, you'll get a copy of it and you can
Okay,
look at
good,
it in
yeah.
your own time. Yeah. Yeah, any other thoughts? We still have 5 minutes. I'm so glad to see all of you.
I just can't figure out why Jesus founded the church on Peter, of all people in the world.
That's right.
Why
I said
had-
that before.
Why do you think it was Peter? He just got stuff wrong all the time.
Lazy,
Gives us something to
a
talk
coward.
about.
Maybe he's closest to being human.
I like to call him a doofus, because that's really what he was. He just never got stuff until way after Jesus died.
I think a lot of us are like that.
I can tell the upper room was probably the first time he clicked on what was going on.
And a lot of movies and TV shows portray him that way too. It's kind of like a common theme.
What were you going to
So as
say?
Polly said, that maybe made him more human. Maybe Jesus realized, well,
I think because he's,
So think about the whole thing about circumcising the Gentiles. He was all head up on circumcising the Gentiles, and Paul is like, no, we're not talking literal circumcision. And you're not going to do that. But that's like an indication to me that he doesn't have an expansive range of thought. He's very narrow.
yes, I agree with that. I think he misinterpreted that whole thing with circumcision. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well, if you go back to the New Testament and the conflicts that arose over bringing in the non-Jews into the church, bringing in the Gentiles, and there was this conflict that arose with Paul's people who were increasingly Gentile, and Peter, who was the head of the Jerusalem church, and where the Jewish converts really were troubled by eating with these pagans. How can these Christian converts from the Gentile community sit down at the same table with the Jewish converts? Well, ultimately, Peter did resolve that conflict. He eventually was able to say, you guys who are Gentiles, we will sit at table with you, but there are just a few little things we ask that you refrain from. Refrain from eating sacrifice from the pagan temples.
Yeah.
And refrain from blood refrain from eating sacrifices from the pagan temple, and generally speaking, honor the sexual mores of the Jews.
But I think it was more not to give offense
Not to give
than it was
offense.
a set of rules.
Right. So Peter did something very important there. Paul
Yes.
clearly was secondary in that whole conflict. It was Peter who had to call the shots.
Yeah, but he got the vision from the Lord when he was on the roof,
Yes,
where he
did.
saw that you could eat everything, and that was for him clear. Before that, he did agree with what was going on,
Exactly.
because Paul criticized him when he was sitting with the Jew and said, "Hey, you have two faces, right? What are you doing here?" That's the case, and then he went up to the roof for prayer, and God gave him a vision that everything was okay to eat
Everything
what?
was clean. It's not what goes into your mouth that is defiling.
Yeah.
It's what comes out of your mouth
Exactly.
that is defiling. So Peter had that vision. In that day and time, that was profound. And that allowed the Gentile and Jewish communities to sit down at the same table and to share their Christian communion.
But then again, as Jetty said, it had to be a vision to tell him what
Right,
to do.
exactly.
He didn't
He
do
did
it
it
on
by
his own.
himself,
So
yeah.
you're giving him too much credit.
So
I said, no, you,
That is a profound vision.
Yeah.
That what goes in
so
is
to his
not
credit,
defiling.
Peter followed him and listened to him and carried.
It's what comes out that is defiling. So
But
that,
Jesus had already taught that when he taught about the whited sepulchres, when he ate with the tax collectors and the sinners.
Exactly.
He'd already taught that.
yes, he did. You're right. So they're slow learners, Leslie.
Any repetition.
What else is new? The whole church is a slow learner.
Oh, yes.
To this day.
Oh, yeah.
To this day.
So any other thoughts, my friends? This has been interesting. I like it. I hope you guys
Very interesting. Very
had a good time. How are you doing, Jeannie?
Well, I'm aching from head to toe, so I'm not doing well.
You got
I'm
food?
listening.
Well, we're glad you're here. And you can see our little room has expanded. We have 2 new people. You may not all know them.
I'm new with the Bible. I need kindergarten level.
Would the 2 of you introduce yourselves to our Zoom crew?
Hi, I'm Monique. I think I Zoomed a couple times ago. So I think a couple of you are familiar, so it's nice to see you and be part of our group.
I'm caller.
I'm Christina, so this is my first.
So
I brought her along as my buddy.
we have a couple others that haven't made it this time. I don't know what's happened to Gay Smith out in the desert. And I know that Rebecca is in the throes of having made a move from California to New Mexico and is probably in the throes of setting up a new household. But hopefully, she was here last week. We hope we'll get her back again. So let us have a prayer. Jetty, I would like you to come do this with me. We're going to pay attention to our icons that we have up here and use a Jewish prayer that we are very fond of.
Okay. Do you know it?
Yes, take my hand.
What?
Would you take my hand? In the name of Adonai,
The God of Israel. May the angel Michael be at our right, and the angel Gabriel be at our left, and in front of us the angel Uriel,
and behind us
the angel Raphael, and above our heads the Shekinah, the divine presence. Amen.
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 That's
That's
why we
beautiful.
put those icons up here of the 4 archangels.
Yeah.
I love them very much. So, I hope we'll see you all next time, and we'll be in touch with what we want to accomplish on that next session. And you guys will lay out the handouts and you can take them and hole punch them, because I just didn't get it done. So bye-bye, you guys. We love you.
Bye-bye.
Love you a bunch.
Have a good week.
Take care.
Feel better, Jeannie.
Feel better.